The human heart is a cartography of hidden chambers, a place where the person we present to the world rarely matches the one we keep in the quiet of the night. We all carry a secondary self, a shadow that walks beside us, waiting for the right moment to emerge or the wrong moment to be caught. Tonight, we find ourselves in the salt-misted air of San Francisco in the year 1902, where the gaslights flicker against the damp cobblestones and the Pacific breeze carries the scent of roasted coffee and old timber. We meet a man named John Gavin, a 39-year-old who understood the weight of a secret better than most. To his neighbors, he was perhaps just another face in the crowd of the growing western metropolis. But to the federal authorities, he was a ghost they had been chasing through the fog for a very long time. The morning of April 8th, 1902, began with a stillness that suggested nothing out of the ordinary. At 6 o'clock, the city was just beginning to stir. The sky was a bruised purple, transitioning into the gray of a coastal dawn. Police officers A.O. Jewell and E.C. Gould were finishing their shift, their boots echoing with a rhythmic hollow sound as they walked toward Lotta's fountain. They were dressed in civilian clothes, looking like any other working men heading home for a well-earned rest. They stood waiting for an outgoing Market Street car, the iron tracks humming slightly with the approach of distant machinery. It was an hour of soft transitions, where the night shift met the morning light, and most eyes were downcast, focused on the prospect of breakfast or sleep. However, Officer Jewell possessed the observing qualities that separate a lawman from a pedestrian. As a northbound 3rd Street car rattled past, heading out toward Kearny Street, his gaze drifted to the back platform. There, he saw two men who looked remarkably out of place for the hour. They were covered in mud, their clothing tattered and damp, as if they had spent the night trekking through the marshes or climbing over the sides of a rusted vessel. Between them sat 3 large telescope baskets, woven, expandable luggage common to the era. But these were bulging and heavy. The contrast between the rough, dilapidated appearance of the men and the deliberate way they guarded their luggage sparked a flame of suspicion in Jewell's mind. He nudged Gould, and without a word, the 2 officers broke into a sprint, chasing the moving trolley car as it gathered speed. They boarded the rear platform, their breaths coming in steady rhythms, and walked through the center of the car. The interior smelled of stale tobacco and the faint, sweet scent of ozone from the electric lines above. They found the 2 men seated near the front. The men looked up, their faces etched with the exhaustion of a long night's labor. Jewell, keeping his voice low and conversational, began to question them. The answers he received were clipped and evasive. When asked what they were carrying, if perhaps the baskets were filled with clams from the wharf, one of the men replied with a sullen, singular no. He claimed the baskets didn't even belong to them, that they were merely transporting them for a friend. While Jewell kept the men engaged, Gould reached out. He poked a finger through a small aperture in the side of one of the baskets. His skin met the cold, hard surface of a tin. In that moment, the suspicion solidified into certainty. He knew the weight and the feel of those tins. It was opium. As the car rolled to a stop directly in front of the Hall of Justice, Jewell reached into his pocket and produced his silver star. The authority of the law suddenly filled the cramped space of the trolley. He ordered the men, later identified as John Gavin and Joseph Kirk, to step off the car. Gavin made a slight, instinctive movement to resist, a tensing of the shoulders, but Gould was faster, hauling him off the platform and onto the pavement. Inside the chief's office, the baskets were opened, revealing a staggering haul. 235 tail cans of high-grade opium. The air in the room grew thick with a heavy, floral, and earthy scent of the drug. These 115 pounds of contraband represented a fortune in 1902, valued at nearly $14 per pound, with a staggering duty of $6 per pound that the government was eager to collect. Gavin and Kirk were marched to the top floor of the Hall of Justice, to the city prison that looked out over the skyline they had hoped to vanish into. They gave the false names of John Duffy and Joseph Murphy, clinging to their secondary identities even as the iron doors slid shut. As the day progressed, the shadow lives of these men began to come into focus. Joseph Kirk was found to be a fireman on the City of Puebla, a vessel that had arrived in port just the previous Monday. John Gavin had once worked on the same boat. The federal authorities began to weave together a narrative of a sophisticated smuggling ring operating between Victoria, British Columbia, and the California coast. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. The opium would be brought from China, transferred to Kirk at Victoria, and then slipped past the customs agents in San Francisco under the cover of darkness. Gavin was no stranger to the dangers of his profession. He carried the literal scars of his double life, having been badly wounded by a customs officer during a previous smuggling attempt in Honolulu. Kirk was equally notorious, recognized as a man who had once eluded capture by leaping into the frigid bay and swimming beneath the dark, jagged pilings of the docks to escape Inspector Sprague. They were dangerous men, according to the records, part of a phantom economy that thrived in the spaces between the piers and the fog. When brought before the customs surveyor and special agents, Gavin and Kirk remained loath to talk. They sat in the heavy wooden chairs of the interrogation room, the ticking of a wall clock the only sound in the silence. Gavin eventually offered a weak defense to a representative of the San Francisco Call, claiming he was merely a messenger paid $2 to deliver the baskets to the Golden Eagle Hotel. He swore he had met a stranger in a saloon on the corner of 3rd and Harrison who had handed him the plunder. It was a story as thin as the coastal mist, and no one believed it. Rumors swirled that Gavin had already amassed a personal fortune of $20,000 from his illicit trade, a king's ransom at the turn of the century. Yet, despite his wealth, he ended up in a cell at the McNeil Island Penitentiary. He was sentenced to 2 years, ultimately serving 20 months due to good behavior. The man who had navigated the treacherous waters of the Pacific and survived a shootout in Hawaii found his world reduced to the dimensions of a stone room. The capture of Gavin and Kirk reminds us that the life we choose is often a heavy basket we carry, hoping no one pokes a finger through the gaps to see what lies inside. As the investigation into the rest of the ring continued, the city of San Francisco moved on, the trolley cars continuing their loops, the bells clanging in the distance, and the Hall of Justice standing as a silent sentry over the secrets of the bay. The opium was seized, the reward was distributed to the observant officers, and the shadows of 3rd Street stretched just a little bit longer as the sun dipped below the horizon. We can rest now, knowing that the frantic chase through the streets of 1902 is over. The mud has dried, the tins are locked away, and the men who sought their fortunes in the dark have long since found their peace. The night is still, and the weight of the past is a burden you do not have to carry. You are safe in the present, wrapped in the quiet of your own home, far from the cold docks and the prying eyes of the law. Sleep comes as a gentle fog, blurring the lines of the day until only the softness of the pillows remains. Turn your mind away from the baskets and the clatter of the tracks. The story has reached its conclusion, and the silence that follows is your own. The early light of a San Francisco morning often brings a particular kind of stillness, a moment when the city's breath is visible in the cooling salt air before the gears of commerce begin their daily grind. In April of 1902, this dawn was no different, settling over the cobblestones with a gray, persistent weight that seemed to muffle the distant clatter of the waterfront. At precisely 6 o'clock, the intersection near Lotta's fountain was nearly empty, save for the occasional shadow shifting in the mist. The fountain itself, a gift of golden bronze and intricate carvings, stood as a silent sentry at the meeting of Market, Geary, and Kearny streets. It was a landmark of stability in a city that was always moving, always reaching for the next horizon. 2 men stood by the fountain, their collars turned up against the damp chill. Officers A.O. Jewell and E.C. Gould were not on duty in the traditional sense. They were merely 2 weary souls making their way home after a long night's watch. They were dressed in the plain, unpretentious clothes of private citizens, their presence at the fountain a routine stop as they waited for an outgoing Market Street car to carry them toward rest. The air smelled of wood smoke, wet stone, and the faint, lingering scent of the Pacific, a sensory tapestry that usually signaled the end of a long shift. As they waited, the rhythmic hum of a northbound 3rd Street car began to vibrate through the tracks. It rattled into view, a solitary vessel of yellow wood and iron, carving a path through the morning haze as it headed toward Kearny Street. Officer Jewell, a man whose eyes were trained to find the discord in a melody, watched the car as it passed. He noticed 2 men seated in the forward portion of the vehicle. They did not look like the typical early morning laborers heading toward the docks. These men were disheveled, their clothing caked with drying mud, as if they had spent the dark hours in the trenches of the earth or the sludge of the shoreline. Beside them sat 3 large telescope baskets, heavy, reinforced containers used for transporting bulky goods. The contrast between the men's dilapidated appearance and the substantial luggage they guarded caught Jewell's attention. It was a detail that felt out of place in the quietude of the morning. Without a word, Jewell nudged Gould, and the 2 officers broke into a sprint, their boots striking the pavement in a sharp, rhythmic tempo as they chased the moving car. They caught the back platform, pulling themselves up into the vibrating interior, moving silently through the aisle toward the men who would soon be known to the world as John Gavin and Joseph Kirk. The suspects, later identified by the aliases Murphy and Duffy, looked up with wary, hooded eyes as the 2 strangers approached. Jewell began the exchange with the practiced, casual tone of a man merely curious about the world. He looked at the heavy baskets, the wicker strained by whatever lay inside, and asked a simple, grounding question. He asked if the baskets were filled with clams, perhaps suggesting a mundane harvest from the bay. One of the men replied with a sullen, one-word denial. When asked if the property was theirs, the spokesman claimed they belonged to a friend, his voice evasive and thin. While Jewel kept the conversation drifting, Officer Gould moved closer, his hand reaching out to inspect the aperture of one basket. His finger brushed against the cold, unmistakable surface of a tin. The realization settled over the officers with a quiet, heavy certainty. This was not the harvest of the sea, but the plunder of a far more dangerous trade. As the car rattled directly in front of the Hall of Justice, Jewel reached into his coat and revealed his star, the metal catching the pale morning light. The transition from a quiet commute to a federal arrest was swift and silent. Gavin attempted a brief, futile resistance, but he was quickly hauled from the car. Within minutes, the men in their baskets were inside the chief's office, where the lids were peeled back to reveal 235-tael cans of opium. Over 100 pounds of shadows and dreams, valued at a fortune in the currency of the time. The long night for Gavin and Kirk was over. But for the city, the mystery of the smuggling ring was only just beginning to unravel. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep, letting the steady rhythm of the past carry you away from the concerns of the present. Tonight, we return to a world of gaslight and cobblestones, beginning with a man standing in the mud of 3rd Street, holding a secret that weighed exactly 115 pounds. The air in San Francisco at 6 o'clock on that April morning in 1902 was thick with the scent of salt spray and the damp, heavy fog that often rolls in from the Pacific, clinging to the ironwork of Lotta's fountain like a cold shroud. It was a transitional hour, a time when the night owls were retreating into the shadows and the early risers were just beginning to stir the city into life. Tonight, we follow John Gavin, a man who lived twice. Once as a laborer on the docks of the Pacific, hauling cargo and blending into the rough-hewn scenery of the waterfront, and once as a shadow in the federal ledgers, a ghost whose real name was often swapped for the alias of Murphy. As we unravel the details of his 1902 arrest, we will see his story reflected in the ghosts of others who wore masks to survive. Individuals who navigated the narrow, treacherous straits between who they were and who the law required them to be. Gavin was not alone in his burden. He was accompanied by Joseph Kirk, another man of shifting identities who went by the name Duffy, both of them standing on the back platform of a northbound trolley car, trying to look unremarkable despite the filth on their clothes and the heavy telescope baskets at their feet. The mud of 3rd Street was notorious for its ability to ruin a man's boots. Yet for Gavin and Kirk, the grime was the least of their worries. They had just come from the docks, perhaps still feeling the sway of the city of Puebla beneath their feet, a vessel that had recently arrived from Victoria. Within those baskets lay 235-tael cans of opium, a haul that represented a small fortune of $12 to $14 per pound, a staggering sum when one considers the average laborer's wage of the era. The weight of the opium was physical, pressing down on the floorboards of the streetcar. But the weight of the risk was even heavier. Every rattle of the trolley over the tracks must have felt like a heartbeat, and every glance from a fellow passenger likely felt like a spotlight. Officers Jewel and Gould standing by the fountain in their civilian clothes, were not looking for a fight that morning. They were simply waiting for their own ride home after a long shift. But the observing qualities mentioned in the later press reports were sharp. They noticed the contrast, the rough, dilapidated appearance of the men, and the expensive, heavy nature of the luggage they carried at such an improbable hour. It was a moment where the two worlds of San Francisco collided, the world of the law and the world of the underground. Under the gray, indifferent sky of a California spring, the transition from the Victorian era into the Progressive era was not just a change in the calendar. It was a fundamental shift in how society viewed the criminal class. We moved now from the immediate tension of the streetcar arrest toward a broader understanding of the architecture of judgment. The mid-19th century had been defined by the dungeon philosophy, dark, damp holes where men were forgotten and left to rot. However, by 1902, the concept of the reformatory was beginning to take hold. There was a growing belief that the environment could shape a person, and that perhaps, through labor and discipline, the dangerous men, like Gavin and Kirk, could be molded into something more acceptable to the state. This shift in thought was visible in the very stones of the prisons of the time. The old ways of corporal punishment were slowly being replaced by the silent system and the broom factory, where the clatter of machinery provided a new kind of cadence to a life of penance. Yet, as we look closer at the institutions that awaited men like John Gavin, we find that the walls were often thinner than they appeared, and the masks people wore were far more complex than a simple alias in a police ledger. The law sought to categorize every soul it touched. But as we shall see, the human spirit has a way of slipping through the bars, seeking a different kind of freedom in the quiet corners of history. The heavy granite facade of the San Francisco Hall of Justice stood as a silent sentinel over Kearny Street, its gray stones absorbing the morning mist until they appeared almost black against the waking sky. When John Gavin and Joseph Kirk were led through those massive doors in April of 1902, they were entering a building that was, in itself, a physical manifestation of the era's shifting moral compass. Built in the late 1890s, the structure was a masterpiece of Victorian intimidation, crowned by a looming clock tower that seemed to count down the remaining moments of a prisoner's liberty with a rhythmic, metallic finality. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of floor wax, cigar smoke, and the damp wool of overcoats, a sensory landscape that defined the boundary between the free world and the captive one. We find that the interior was designed not just for function, but for a specific kind of psychological pressure. The corridors were vast and lined with polished marble that echoed every footfall, making it impossible for a man to move without the state hearing his approach. High above the main intake area, the whispering galleries allowed attorneys, police inspectors, and informants to pace the upper balconies, their hushed conversations drifting down like ghost voices to the men waiting in the holding pens below. It was a place where lives were bartered for information, and where the cold Victorian belief in the dungeon was beginning to give way to a new, perhaps more invasive, philosophy of reform. By 1901, the American penal system was undergoing a profound and quiet evolution. The old days of purely corporal punishment, the whip, the branding iron, and the public shaming, were being replaced by the new penology. This was the dawn of the progressive era reformatory, a system that sought to do more than just break a man's back with labor. It sought to own his mind. The state began to believe that through the silent system, a prisoner could be cured of his criminal leanings. Inmates were often forbidden from speaking to one another, forced to work in absolute communal silence, the theory being that in the absence of external vice, the soul would be forced to confront its own transgressions. As we examine the architectural blueprints of the era's cell blocks, we see a shift toward total surveillance. The tiers were arranged so that a single guard, standing at the end of a long, iron-grated walkway, could peer into the private world of dozens of men at once. This was the architecture of judgment, where the prisoner was never truly alone, yet never allowed to connect with his fellow man. For a smuggler like Gavin, who had lived a life of coastal winds and open seas, the transition to a 1902 federal cell was a shock of sensory deprivation. The state no longer wanted to just punish the act of smuggling. It wanted to dismantle the identity of the smuggler himself, replacing the dangerous man with a docile, productive unit of labor. In the prison broom factories and tailor shops, men worked with a mechanical precision, their hands moving in rhythm with the ticking of the hall clocks. There was a heavy, rhythmic quality to this existence. The scrape of a chair, the hiss of a steam pipe, the clink of a tin cup against bars. This was the era where the prison became a machine and the inmate became a cog within it. The transition from the chaotic, dark dungeons of the mid-1800s to these sterile, silent halls of the early 1900s marked a turning point in history. It was a time when the law believed it could finally map the human heart, and through the quiet weight of stone and schedule, guide it back toward the light. The heavy iron doors of the reception center at McNeil Island did not just close. They settled into their frames with a finality that seemed to draw the very oxygen from the hallway. For a man like John Gavin, the transition from the salt-sprayed deck of a steamer to the sterile, whitewashed interior of a federal penitentiary was a shock to the senses that no amount of criminal experience could prepare him for. The air here did not move with the tides. It smelled of lye soap, scorched wool, and the faint, metallic tang of aging pipes. It was here, in the early months of 1902, that the man the newspapers called a dangerous smuggler was reduced to a series of measurements and notations in a leather-bound ledger. The intake process was a ritual of stripped identity. We see Gavin standing in the chilly draft of the processing room, his mud-stained clothes, the same ones he wore during his desperate flight through the streets of San Francisco, piled in a heap on the stone floor. The guards of this era were proponents of the new scientific reform, a belief that cleanliness was the first step toward a corrected soul. He was scrubbed with harsh brushes and directed into a suit of coarse, striped denim that felt like sandpaper against skin weathered by the Pacific winds. Every scar on his body, including the jagged mark left by a customs officer's bullet in Honolulu, was catalogued with clinical indifference. This was the architecture of the progressive era, a system that sought to peel back the layers of a man until only the raw data of his existence remained. As Gavin was led to his cell, the silence of the island began to settle over him like a physical weight. McNeil Island was unique among federal prisons. It lacked the towering stone walls of Sing Sing or the jagged cliffs of Alcatraz. Instead, it relied on the cold, churning waters of the Puget Sound to act as its primary sentry. The isolation was psychological. From the small, barred window of the upper tiers, a prisoner could watch the mist roll over the water, seeing the distant silhouette of freedom just a few miles away, yet knowing the currents were strong enough to pull a swimming man into the depths of the Sound in minutes. It was a quiet kind of torture, a constant visual reminder of the world that continued to turn without them. While Gavin adjusted to the rhythm of the bells, one for waking, one for bread, one for the silent labor of the workshops. The federal authorities were still untangling the web he had left behind. The 230 cans of opium seized from his baskets were more than just contraband. They were evidence of a sophisticated ring that stretched from the dens of Victoria to the hotels of San Francisco. The investigation moved with a slow, deliberate pace, much like the life Gavin now led. Every morning, he joined the line of silent men, their footfalls echoing in a synchronized beat against the floor, moving toward the broom factory or the laundry, where the only sound allowed was the hum of machinery. It was in this muffled world that the Smilin' Bandit and the Opium King would spend their days, waiting for the ticking clock of their sentences to slowly unwind. The cold, gray light of 6 o'clock in the morning on April 8th, 1902, found San Francisco waking up in a slow, rhythmic crawl. At Lotta's fountain, a local landmark where the city's many paths crossed, police officers A.O. Jewell and E.C. Gould stood in their civilian clothes, waiting for an outgoing Market Street car to take them home after a long shift. The air was damp with the lingering mist of the Pacific, and the streets were mostly silent, save for the occasional chime of a trolley bell. It was in this quiet moment that Jewell's eyes were drawn to a northbound 3rd Street car. On the platform stood 2 men who seemed to be trying very hard to look like they belonged to the early morning grime of the waterfront. They were covered in thick, drying mud, their clothes tattered and salt-stained, looking for all the world like weary laborers returning from a long night of honest, back-breaking toil. Between them sat 3 telescope baskets, those expandable wicker cases common to travelers of the era, which looked just as dilapidated as the men themselves. To a casual observer, they were merely 2 more drifters in a city full of them. But Jewell possessed the keen, observing qualities of a man who knew that in the underworld, the best mask is often the one that looks most like reality. This was the urban camouflage of the smuggler. The mud and the rags were meant to deflect interest, acting as a visual signal that there was nothing here worth stealing or questioning. But the hour was too early, and the weight of the baskets as the men shifted them seemed too heavy for mere personal effects. Jewell signaled to Gould, and together the 2 officers broke into a sprint, catching the moving car and boarding the back platform as it rattled down Kearny Street. They walked through the car, the wood floor vibrating beneath their boots, until they reached the front where the 2 men sat, huddled near their luggage. Jewell began to question them, his voice low and steady to avoid causing a scene among the few other passengers. The men, who would later be identified as John Gavin and Joseph Kirk, gave answers that were short and evasive, their eyes darting toward the floor. Jewel pointed to the largest of the telescope baskets and asked a simple, probing question. "What have you got there?" "Clams." It was a logical guess for men dressed like dock workers. Yet one of the fellows looked up with a sullen expression and simply muttered, "No." When asked if the baskets belonged to them, the spokesman claimed they were merely delivering them for a friend. While Jewel kept their attention, Officer Gould leaned down, his fingers brushing against the wicker. He found a small aperture in the side of one basket and poked his finger through the gap. Instead of the soft, wet shells of clams or the fabric of old clothes, his skin met the unmistakable cold, hard surface of a tin. The realization dawned on him instantly. He caught Jewel's eye and gave a subtle nod. It wasn't seafood they were hauling through the heart of the city, but the black smoke, opium. As the trolley pulled up directly in front of the Hall of Justice, Jewel didn't wait for the next stop. He pulled back his coat to reveal his silver star and informed Kirk and Gavin they were under arrest. Gavin attempted a slight, desperate resistance, a momentary tensed muscle before Gould's heavy hand hauled him off the car and toward the station. Once inside the chief's office, the baskets were pried open, revealing the true scale of the haul. 235 tall cans of high-grade opium, weighing roughly 115 pounds. The room began to smell of the metallic tang of the tins and the earthy scent of the mud still clinging to the prisoners' coats. These were not mere delivery boys. They were experienced players in a sophisticated Pacific trade. Gavin had once been shot by customs officials in Honolulu, and Kirk was a known water rat who had previously escaped capture by jumping into the bay and swimming beneath the dark cover of the docks. Their mud-stained clothes had been a masterpiece of deception, a mask designed to make the extraordinary look mundane. Yet it was that very commitment to the part that had ultimately betrayed them to a pair of officers simply waiting for a ride home. As the heavy iron doors of the city prison clicked shut on the top floor of the Hall of Justice, the investigation began to ripple outward, toward the steamships and the hidden coves of the coast. But that's not even the strangest part of how these networks operated. To understand how 115 pounds of opium ended up on a streetcar, we have to look toward the water, where the true machinery of the trade hummed in the shadows of the docks. The Pacific trade of 1902 was a living, breathing creature, and its primary artery was the city of Puebla. This massive iron steamship, belonging to the Pacific Coast Steamship Company, was more than just a vessel. It was a floating city that bridged the gap between the British influence of Victoria and the wild, untamed energy of San Francisco. To the average traveler, the Puebla was a marvel of modern engineering, its decks smelling of salt spray and expensive tobacco, its hull cutting through the cold, gray swells of the Pacific with a rhythmic, reassuring thrum. But beneath the polished wood and the white linens of the dining saloon, the ship carried a second, silent cargo. Men like Joseph Kirk worked in the belly of the beast as firemen, shoveling coal into the roaring furnaces, their skin stained with soot and their lungs heavy with the heat of the engines. It was in these cramped, sweltering quarters that the connective tissue of the smuggling ring took hold. The geography of the trade was dictated by the rugged coastline. Between the pristine harbors of British Columbia and the fog-shrouded entrance to the Golden Gate lay 1,000 miles of jagged rocks and hidden inlets. Smugglers looked at this map not as a journey, but as a series of handoffs. Opium, processed in the dens of Victoria, would be spirited aboard the Puebla under the cover of a busy port. Once the ship docked in San Francisco, the challenge shifted from the sea to the shore. The Barbary Coast was a chaotic sprawl of dance halls, boarding houses, and saloons where a man could disappear in an instant. This neighborhood, fueled by vice and the desperate dreams of sailors, provided the perfect camouflage for men moving telescope baskets filled with illicit tins. The air here was thick with the scent of roasting coffee from the nearby warehouses, mixed with the damp, rotting smell of the wooden piers. To counter this ghost-like movement, the federal government began to assemble a different kind of barrier. They realized that they could not patrol every inch of the Pacific, so they began to build a wall of paper. The customs house in San Francisco became the nerve center of this new bureaucracy. Led by Collector of the Port Stratton, a small army of clerks and special agents began to document every soul and every crate that crossed the threshold of the pier. They were crafting a net made of manifests, ledger books, and physical descriptions. It was a slow, meticulous evolution of law enforcement, the birth of the modern border. Every sailor's history was scrutinized. Every previous arrest, like John Gavin's violent encounter in Honolulu, was filed away in mahogany cabinets. The federal agents were no longer just looking for crates. They were looking for patterns. They were waiting for the moment when the physical reality of a muddy coat and a heavy basket didn't match the story written on the official forms. The customs house itself was a fortress of order in a city of chaos. Inside, the sound of scratching nibs and the rhythmic thud of official stamps created a soundtrack to the government's growing reach. While the smugglers relied on the darkness of the docks and the anonymity of the crowd, the inspectors relied on the stillness of the record. They tracked the ring through whispers and informants, slowly identifying the firemen and deckhands who made the trade possible. This wall of bureaucracy was designed to be impassable, yet it only made the smugglers more creative, forcing them to find new ways to slip through the cracks of the very system designed to cage them. The tension between the fluid, shifting world of the Pacific trade and the rigid, ink-stained world of the federal authorities was reaching a breaking point. As the sun dipped below the horizon of the San Francisco Bay, casting long shadows across the custom house steps, the quiet work of the clerks continued, unaware that their next big breakthrough was already sitting in the mud-stained baskets of a 3rd Street car. Within the hushed, sterile corridors of the Hall of Justice, the masks of John Duffy and Joseph Murphy began to slip, revealing the weathered features of men far more dangerous than simple harbor loiterers. The damp chill of the San Francisco morning still clung to their clothes, but a different kind of coldness was settling into the room as the inspectors realized who they were actually holding. It was soon discovered that John Duffy was merely a shadow, a name borrowed to hide the identity of John Gavin, a man whose history was written in lead and salt water. Gavin carried a physical testament to his life of crime, a jagged, silvered scar from a customs officer's bullet, earned during a desperate confrontation on the sun-drenched docks of Honolulu. That wound served as a permanent ledger, a reminder that no matter how many times he changed his name, the Pacific trade always kept its receipts. as the heavy ledger of the San Francisco Call was opened that evening. The ink still fresh, the details of Gavin's unsavory reputation began to fill the pages. He wasn't a newcomer to the ring, the loosely organized syndicate of smugglers who moved opium like ghosts between the ports of Victoria and California. Beside him sat Joseph Kirk, alias Duffy, a man who possessed an almost supernatural ability to vanish when cornered. The federal agents remembered Kirk well. They recalled a pursuit years prior where he had eluded Inspector Sprague by the most desperate of means. He had not fought or surrendered, but had instead thrown himself into the frigid, churning waters of the bay. Swimming beneath the dark, moss-covered pilings of the docks, where the light could not reach him. He had disappeared into the silence of the tides, while his partner, a man known to the underworld as Hoodlum Harry, was led away in irons. The air in the interrogation room was thick with the smell of stale tobacco and the faint, sweet, cloying scent of the 115 pounds of seized opium. When confronted with the evidence, Gavin attempted to weave a final, thin veil of innocence. He looked at the investigators with tired eyes and claimed he was merely a messenger, a simple laborer who had been offered $2 by a stranger in a saloon at the corner of 3rd and Harrison Streets. He swore he was only meant to deliver the baskets to the Golden Eagle Hotel, a humble task for a humble man. It was a lie as transparent as the mist over the Golden Gate. The authorities knew that Kirk was a fireman on the steamship City of Puebla, and that Gavin had served on the same vessel. They were not messengers, but the very heartbeat of the smuggling operation. As the investigation deepened, the sheer scale of their enterprise became clear, with the seized cans valued at a staggering sum that could have bought a comfortable life many times over. Rumors swirled through the city that Gavin had already amassed a fortune of $20,000, a king's ransom hidden away in the shadows. Yet, for all that wealth, he now sat in a cage of stone and iron. The ring was being dismantled, link by link, as the law began to trace the path of the opium back to the poppy fields of the East. The persistence of Gavin's true identity had finally caught up with him, proving that on the smuggler's coast, the past is never truly buried. It only waits for the tide to go out. While Gavin and Kirk began their long wait behind the bars of the county jail, the focus of the city's watchmen began to shift toward the silent machinery of the prison system itself, where other, even more complex deceptions were beginning to unravel in the flickering light of the broom factory. The rhythm of the prison day in 1901 was measured by the mechanical thrum of the broom factory, a place where the scent of dried straw and twine hung heavy in the stagnant air. Among the rows of men bound by the state's judgment was a convict known as Bert Martin, a figure who seemed to blend into the shadows of the workshop with a quiet, almost fragile intensity. To the guards and the other inmates at the Nebraska State Penitentiary, Martin was simply a small-statured horse thief from Keapaha County, a man whose delicate constitution often drew the pity of the overseers. Standing only 5 feet and 4 inches tall and weighing a mere 120 pounds, he was considered far too weak for the back-breaking labor of the stone quarries or the coal piles. Instead, he was assigned to the lighter tasks of the factory, his small, nimble hands working the broom corn with a precision that few others could match. This leniency was born of necessity, as the prison physician had noted that ill health seemed to be slowly undermining Martin's constitution, leaving him pale and prone to exhaustion. Yet, beneath the coarse fabric of the striped uniform and the dust of the factory floor, a secret was being guarded with a level of discipline that surpassed any prison regulation. Bert Martin had been living a double life long before the heavy iron gates of the penitentiary had swung shut behind him. In the rugged landscapes of northeast Nebraska, Martin had built a reputation as an expert borrower of steeds, a ranch hand who could hold his own in a world defined by grit and physical endurance. But the reality of Bert's existence was far more complex than a simple criminal record could suggest. The deception began to unravel not through a failure of character, but through the close, suffocating quarters of the cell block. After 11 months of serving a 2-year sentence, Martin's cellmate approached the prison officials with a whisper of a sensation, a claim that would soon shatter the carefully constructed identity of the prisoner in the broom factory. The subsequent medical examination conducted by the prison physician revealed a truth that the state was wholly unprepared to manage. Bert Martin was, in fact, a woman named Lena Martin. She had abandoned the restrictive expectations of turn-of-the-century womanhood to seek a living in a sparsely populated county where the only way to support a family was through the labor of a man. Lena's life as Bert had not been a mere whim or a temporary disguise. It was a fundamental shift for survival. She had married a single mother who had agreed to keep the secret, providing a stable home and a father figure for a child in an era that offered little mercy to those on the margins of society. Even her own mother had been a silent partner in the ruse, understanding that for Lena, the trousers and the ranch work were the only path to economic independence. The revelation sent a shockwave through the legal system of Nebraska, creating a logistical nightmare for officials who realized they had been housing a woman in an all-male facility for nearly a year. By September 22, 1901, the state scrambled to correct its oversight, preparing to transfer Lena to the women's prison in York. The transition was marked by a peculiar moment of domesticity amidst the cold bureaucracy of the law, as prison officials found themselves forced to go into the city of Lincoln to purchase a dress. The penitentiary, built and managed for men, carried no such stock, and for the first time in years, Lena was draped in the heavy skirts she had worked so hard to discard. The change in attire did nothing to soften the stance of Governor Ezra Savage, who viewed Lena's subversion of gender roles with a deep, visceral disgust. In his official communications, he refused to acknowledge her humanity, referring to her repeatedly as it, labeling her a sexual monstrosity that the prison morals demanded be removed from the sight of others. Eventually, the weight of the scandal and the persistent pleas of Lena's aging mother led the governor to commute her sentence to time served. She was released in February of 1902, fading back into the vast, rolling plains of the West, leaving behind a legacy of a woman who had dared to navigate the world on her own terms. As the echoes of Lena's footsteps faded from the prison corridors, the institution itself was undergoing a different kind of transformation, moving away from the individual dramas of the inmates and toward a future defined by the cold, impersonal machinery of industrial silence. The transition of the Nebraska State Penitentiary from a place of mere confinement to a humming engine of Victorian industry was marked by the relentless rhythm of the steam engine and the sharp, medicinal scent of freshly cut broom corn. Inside these walls, the state discovered that the bodies of the incarcerated, once seen only as a burden on the public purse, could be transformed into a source of significant revenue through the contract labor system. We find ourselves walking through the corridors of 1901, where the air grows heavy with the fine, irritating dust of the broom factory. A place where the individual identity of someone like Bert Martin was systematically stripped away to create a unit of production. This was the machinery of silence, a philosophy of management that dictated that if a prisoner's hands were busy and their mouth was shut, their soul would eventually follow into a state of manageable submission. The broom factory was a labyrinth of specialized stations, each designed to break down the complex craft of broom making into repetitive, mindless tasks that could be performed by men weakened by the prison's meager rations and damp cells. At one end of the long hall, the raw broom corn was sorted by length and quality, its stiff fibers rustling like dry grass in a winter wind. We see the workers, their faces masked by thin cloths to keep the dust from their lungs, as they move with a synchronized, mechanical precision that leaves no room for conversation or reflection. The state had realized that by leasing this labor to private contractors, they could undercut the prices of honest tradesmen on the outside, effectively turning the penitentiary into a manufacturing powerhouse fueled by the impossible lives of those the world had forgotten. Further into the industrial heart of the prison lay the cooperage, where the sounds were more violent and the labor far more taxing. Here, the air was filled with the pungent aroma of toasted oak and the deafening metallic ring of hammers driving iron hoops onto wooden barrels. Each barrel represented a calculated profit for the institution, a tangible result of the hours of sweat and strain extracted from the inmates. In this environment, a person was no longer a name or a story. They were a tally mark in a ledger, a gear in a vast wooden machine that operated from sunrise to sunset. The physical toll was immense, as the heavy lifting and constant exposure to heat and noise left the men exhausted, their spirits ground down by the sheer monotony of the work. This industrialization created a strange paradox within the prison walls, where the silence was not the absence of sound, but the presence of a dominant mechanical roar that drowned out the human voice. It was a silence of the spirit, enforced by the overseers who watched from elevated platforms, their eyes scanning for any sign of slowing pace or whispered communication. For Lena Martin, working in the broom factory under the guise of Bert, this environment provided a layer of protection. The dust and the noise allowed her to blend into the shadows of the production line. Yet, it also reinforced the tragedy of her situation. As her life was reduced to the number of brooms she could assemble in a day, her humanity eclipsed by the very machinery designed to profit from her confinement. The state viewed these individuals as renewable resources, easily replaced if they broke under the strain, ensuring that the wheels of the prison industry continued to turn long after the names of the workers had been lost to time. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long barred shadows across the factory floor, the machines would finally groan to a halt, leaving a ringing void in the ears of the men. They would be marched back to their cells in a somber procession, the silence of the evening feeling heavier than the noise of the day. We leave the industrial chill of the 1901 workshops now, traveling forward in time to the 1920s, where the echoes of the prison industry would find a different kind of resonance in the life of a man who refused to be a mere unit of production. Would you like me to move into the next chapter, where we encounter the daring exploits of Roy Gardner, the smiling bandit, and the radical defiance of Leon Czolgosz? The shift from the physical labor of the 19th century to the psychological warfare of the 20th was nowhere more evident than in the life of Roy Gardner. By the 1920s, the rigid silence of the old prison systems had begun to fracture, replaced by a new kind of celebrity that turned the inmate into a public fascination. Gardner, known to the newspapers as the Smiling Bandit, was a man who understood that in the modern era, an identity could be a weapon. While earlier prisoners were often reduced to mere numbers in a ledger, Gardner cultivated a persona so vibrant that it seemed to mock the very walls intended to hold him. He was a lone wolf who managed to steal over $350,000 in cash and securities. Yet he did so with a charm that captured the imagination of a West Coast weary of traditional outlaws. We see him not as a desperate man in a cell, but as a figure of constant movement. On McNeil Island, a federal penitentiary that famously lacked the towering stone walls of its contemporaries, Gardner became a legend of evasion. Though history tells us he was not the first to escape the island, the myth of his invincibility grew with every successful flight. To the public, he was the mail-train bandit, a daring ghost who could vanish into the Pacific mist. But this persona was a heavy cloak to wear. In the quiet moments between his sensational trials and his eventual time in the dark corridors of Alcatraz, the man behind the smile was slowly being hollowed out. He was becoming a character in a story he no longer controlled, a film salesman of his own tragedy who would eventually find the weight of his reputation impossible to bear. As the sun sets over the rugged coastlines where Gardner once roamed, we travel back to the turning of the century, to a moment when identity was stripped away, not by celebrity, but by the cold, clinical hand of the state. In 1901, the name Leon Czolgosz represented something far more polarizing than a mere bandit. He had become a cause. A young man caught in the fervor of the anarchist movement, Czolgosz viewed the world through a lens of profound inequality. He saw the wealthy exploiting the poor and believed that the only way to heal the social fabric was to strike at its head. On a warm September day, at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, he approached President William McKinley with a revolver concealed in a handkerchief. The 2 shots fired that day did more than wound a leader. They accelerated the machinery of justice into a terrifying, efficient pace. While McKinley lay dying from a slow-moving infection, the legal system prepared for a conclusion that was already written. The trial of Czolgosz was a stark contrast to the long, drawn-out media circuses of the later 20th century. It began just 17 days after the shooting and lasted a mere 24 hours. There is no room for the nuance of his motivations or the complexity of his mind. To the state, he was no longer a man named Leon. He was the physical manifestation of a threat that had to be extinguished with scientific precision. By October, The transition of the death penalty from a public spectacle to a private, industrial process reached its zenith. At Auburn Prison, the electric chair stood ready, a relatively new invention designed to be more humane and clinical than the gallows. On October 29th, only 54 days after the incident, Czolgosz was led to the chair. His final words were a mixture of defiance for his cause and a sudden, heartbreaking return to his private self, expressing a solitary regret that he could not see his father one last time. In those final seconds, the cause faded, leaving only a frightened man in the heavy silence of the execution chamber. This era marked a profound evolution in how the state claimed the lives of those it deemed beyond redemption. Between 1901 and 1940, the transition from the rapid, vengeful justice seen with Czolgosz to the isolated, high-security despair of Gardner's Alcatraz reflected a society obsessed with containment and the erasure of the individual. Gardner would eventually take his own life in a San Francisco hotel room in 1940, leaving a warning on the door about the poison gas he had created. Both men, in their own way, were consumed by the identities the world forced upon them. One a bandit, the other an assassin, leaving behind only the quiet, cold facts of the prison records. The paper trail of Lena Martin did not end with her exposure as a woman, but rather with a series of cold, official documents that stripped away the last of her dignity. By early 1902, she'd been moved to the women's prison in York, Nebraska. Yet the state remained fixated on her existence as a problem to be solved rather than a human to be understood. Governor Ezra Savage, a man whose legacy would be defined by his stern adherence to the rigid social moralities of the Victorian era, found himself personally offended by Lena's deception. To him, the fact that she had successfully lived as a ranch hand, married and worked in a broom factory under the guise of Bert Martin, was not a feat of survival, but a biological and moral affront. In his biennial address, the governor's disdain manifested in a memo so dehumanizing it remains a chilling artifact of the period's legal language. He did not refer to Lena as a woman, nor even as the man she had pretended to be. Instead, he used the pronoun it 4 times in a single sentence, labeling her a sexual monstrosity. His words painted a picture of a creature unfit for the company of either gender, even within the walls of a penitentiary. He granted her a commutation of sentence not out of mercy, but out of a desperate desire to purge the state's records of her presence. On February 3, 1902, Lena was released into the custody of her mother, vanishing into the quiet prairies of the Midwest. No further records of her exist. She became a ghost in the census, perhaps finally finding a name and a life that the law could no longer track or define. While Lena sought to disappear, another woman named Bertha spent 50 years ensuring she was never truly forgotten by the precinct captains of Chicago. In 1897, at 68 years old, Bertha sat in the Joliet Penitentiary, a robust woman with a sharp mind and a weary heart. She was a career shoplifter, a repeater who had seen the inside of Blackwell's Island and Sing Sing, moving through the American penal system like a permanent resident. Bertha's story was one of systemic thieving, yet it began with a single, sensory memory from her childhood in a German village. She often spoke of the day she stole a pocketful of chestnuts and passed a statue of Christ in the public square. She felt the stone eyes pierce her with such condemnation that she threw the nuts away, a moment of childhood guilt that stood in stark contrast to the hardened life she would later lead. Bertha had come to America at 16, marrying a tinsmith she met on the ship. For 16 years, they lived a mundane, honest life until a separation and his subsequent death left her untethered. In the bustling, predatory environment of New York, she was introduced to a gang of professional thieves. She learned that shoplifting was not just a crime, but a trade, a way to secure nice things and avoid the crushing poverty that awaited an aging, unskilled woman in the 1890s. She was part of a sophisticated syndicate of 14 people, some of whom had used their stolen profits to buy real estate in Chicago. Yet, despite her criminal success, Bertha remained deeply spiritual in a haunting, fractured way. She confessed to prison visitors that she prayed every night, but she refused to step foot inside a church, fearing the very rafters would collapse upon her due to her wickedness. She lived in a constant state of internal tension, weeping when asked about her crimes and claiming she simply couldn't help it. To Bertha, the prison had become the only place that truly knew her. It was the only institution that kept a record of her age, her origins, and her weary sighs. For many like her, the anonymity of the outside world was far more frightening than the iron bars of Joliet. In the silence of the cell block, she was not just another face in the Chicago crowd. She was Bertha, the shopkeeper's shadow, a woman who had spent half a century trading her freedom for the heavy, familiar weight of a stolen silk bolt. As the 19th century turned into the 20th, the lives of Lena and Bertha served as bookends to the era of the impossible double life. They were individuals who moved through the world in layers, hiding their gender, their motives, or their histories, just to find a foothold in a society that offered them no place. The prison records they left behind are the only markers of their passage. The it in a governor's memo and the deep sighs of an aging thief. These stories remind us that the darkness of the past was often lit by the small, flickering candles of human resilience, even when that resilience was born of desperation. The heavy iron doors of these 1901 narratives are now beginning to close, and the echoes of the smiling bandit and the shopkeeper are fading into the stillness of history. The figures we have followed tonight, the smugglers, the assassins, and the drifters, have all returned to the earth, their secrets buried with them. You are safe now, separated from their world by the vast, quiet stretch of over a century. The cells are empty, the guards have long since gone home, and the world is at peace. As the air grows cooler and the shadows of the room soften, allow yourself to drift away from these historical echoes. The stories have been told, the records have been closed, and there is nothing left for you to do but rest. The weight of the day is lifting, replaced by a deep, rhythmic calm. You are drifting now toward a horizon of silence, where the only sound is the gentle pull of sleep. The quiet legacy of Bertha, the woman who once feared the stone eyes of statues in a distant German village, eventually faded into the gray stone walls of the Joliet Penitentiary. By the time the 19th century turned into the 20th, her story was no longer one of active crime, but a reflective postscript in a medical ledger. We see her now, not as the sophisticated shoplifter of Chicago's bustling streets, but as an elderly woman sitting in a patch of afternoon sun, perhaps thinking of the free homes for the aged in the village she left behind so long ago. The intensity of her younger years, the influence of the gang, and the weight of the stolen goods had all been replaced by a quiet, rhythmic existence, where the only requirement was to exist in the stillness. The justice system of the time had finished its work, and Bertha, like so many others who walked those corridors, became a part of the building's own memory. As the shadow of the prison towers lengthens over the Illinois fields, we find a similar stillness settling over the records of Lena Martin. The disdain of Governor Savage, once so sharp and public, eventually lost its edge as the years passed, and the sensationalism of her double life was buried under newer headlines. The dresses the state was forced to buy for her have long since turned to dust, and the scandal of a woman working a Nebraska ranch in a man's Stetson has smoothed out into a mere footnote of Western history. There is a profound peace in knowing that these lives, once so fraught with the tension of discovery and the hardship of labor, have reached their final destination. The legal battles are won and lost. The sentences are served, and the loud voices of the courtrooms have softened into a low, distant hum that eventually merges with the wind. The transition from the heavy, iron-bound world of the 1901 inmate to the soft, dark comfort of your own room is almost complete. We can imagine the heavy ledgers of the Hall of Justice being slid back into their wooden slots, the ink dry on the final entries for John Gavin and his crates of tins, the mud that once covered his clothes on that early San Francisco morning has been washed away by over a century of rain. The rattling of the 3rd Street cable car is a sound that has long since vanished from the air, leaving behind only the profound silence of a city at rest. The weight of these histories is not a burden for you to carry into the night. Instead, let the stories act as an anchor, grounding you in the knowledge that everything has its time and every struggle eventually finds its rest. The world of 1901, with its flickering gaslights and its rigid iron bars, is a distant dream, safe and separated from the present by the vast, cool ocean of time. You are safe in the here and now, surrounded by a stillness that is as deep as the Pacific waters John Gavin once sailed. The records are closed, the lights in the corridors have been extinguished, and the only path left is the one that leads into a deep, restorative sleep. There is nothing left to monitor, nothing left to solve, and nothing left to remember. The horizon of the past is fading, and the heavy, warm blanket of the night is all that remains.